Bueno, bienvenidos a este evento sobre las relaciones entre la Unión Europea y China en la era de Trump. Cuando pensamos este evento hace unos meses, por el 50 aniversario del inicio de las relaciones diplomáticas entre la Unión Europea y China, no pensábamos que estas últimas semanas fueran tan interesantes y tan quizá críticas para la relación entre estos dos poderes a causa del terremoto geopolítico que actualmente está causando Donald Trump. Yo creo que este evento hoy servirá para todos los participantes para entender el contexto, la historia y los diferentes actores de la relación entre la Unión Europea y China, pero también la actualidad, qué ha pasado en las últimas semanas y cómo lo que está pasando ahora puede marcar el futuro de la relación. Ahora pasaré al inglés para presentar a los ponentes y seguir con la conversación. So we have with us here three excellent speakers. We have Finbar Birmingham, correspondent in Europe for the South China Morning Post, the best newspaper in Hong Kong and one of the most prestigious newspapers in East Asia. For observers of EU-China relations, Finbar is our man in Brussels since 2021, where he has been explaining to us the day-to-day of EU-China relations. His articles on news, I think, are fundamental reading for anyone interested in how the EU-China relations are evolving. We have also with us Sharon Ergen, bad pronunciation of the name, I'm sorry, a research fellow at the Center for European Policy Studies. She's an expert on Chinese foreign policy, Chinese politics, and EU-China relations. She was for more than 7 years an associated professor at Xi'an Liverpool University in Suzhou, China. And she's affiliated with the East Asian Studies and Research Center at UAB, at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. And last but not least, we have an old friend of CIDOB, Mario Esteban, Senior Fellow at Real Instituto Elcano. He's one of the leading voices on China-Spain relations and EU-China relations. And he's a full professor at the Autonomous University of Madrid and the director of the Center for East Asian Studies at this university, at UAM. So, to start the conversation, I think I would like us to start offering a picture of what has been the evolution of EU-China relations in the past decades and the different actors involved in this relation. Now that it has, as I was saying before, this May was the 50th anniversary of the start of diplomatic relations between these two powers. So my first question will be to Mario. So Mario, can you explain us what has been the evolution of the relations between the EU and China over the past decades, and especially these past 10 critical years?
Thank you, Javier, for the presentation, and thank you so much to CIDOB for having
me.
Sorry,
Mario, we cannot hear you now.
Sorry?
Can you speak again?
Can you hear me?
Now it's better, I think.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to thank you, Javier, for the presentation, and thanks also to CIDOB for having me, even if it's online, because I couldn't make it to Barcelona this time. I would like to ask you, how much time do I have?
Mario, one second, because we cannot hear you very well. I don't know if it's possible to...
So, the problem has to do with my mic or with the logistics there? Shall I try again?
Try again.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
No,
no.
We're talking with the staff to see if we can solve the problem, because now it's good. Now it's good.
Now it's good?
Yeah. Now it's perfect.
Okay, because it sounds terrible here for me, but if it sounds good for you, excellent. Okay, so I will just jump into the question. That since this is such a big question, I would like to ask you for roughly, how much time do I have to answer to this? Roughly.
I mean, you are a professor at university, so I'm sure you're very good at summarizing things. So, I don't know, 5 minutes, if you can.
Okay, yeah, whatever. Yeah, I will abide to that. Okay. So, We can't, I mean, if we talk about these 50 years, we can divide the relationship maybe into 5 main periods. First, a period for, let's say, like early engagement, in the since the 1975, since 1989. At that time, the main focus for the European Economic Community was to explore trade, with promising trade with China, and of course balancing, the Soviet Union. That relations at that time were quite underdeveloped, so we were not very, very significant. But since they were not such a big thing for either of the parts, the relations were not very controversial. Okay, but controversy. The controversy in bilateral relations just came very, very explicitly. In 1989, we all know about the Tiananmen Square crackdown. The massacre of this movement. And that provoked, a very significant political backlash, in Europe vis-a-vis the People's Republic of China. This arms embargo, was imposed, which is still valid today. And also we need to be aware that at that time, also because of the collapse of the Soviet Union, this geopolitical value of the People's Republic of China also was lost, so the European Union lost interest to some extent, in China, although trade, became, being a significant, kept increasing, even at that time, even if political relations chilled, and even if cooperation in other areas, was hindered, but trade, kept going. And then we move into a third phase, where we can talk about the golden era, in the bilateral relations, since mid-1990s till the global financial crisis in 2008, and in this period, the EU look at China mainly as an opportunity, particularly an economic opportunity. The EU-China summits were launched in 1998, and this bilateral comprehensive strategic partnership was established in 2003. So there was a period of massive trade expansion, also very significant increase in the investment. The EU became China's largest trading partner, and vice versa. And also many sectorial dialogues were open over education, environment. So it was, the relation was blooming, at that time. Even there were some challenges, but I don't want to get now into that. We don't have much time. But let's say, it was a time basically, of a lot of expectation, opportunity, and very significant increase in the bilateral relations across all the spectrum. But then, the global financial crisis came, and it was obvious that China was becoming, let's say, a more assertive, actor, international actor, and also there were some issues, some bilateral issues, in trade, for example, the famous lack of reciprocity, the lack of level playing field, the issues that are still there, that they started to be very important, at that time. Well, also, the EU reactive in a very divided way, and also negatively to some countries, to the Belt and Road Initiative, which was a clear example of this growing assertiveness of China. And also there were concerns about human rights, Tibet, Xinjiang. So, the irritants started to be more evident in the relationship, And then we can see that we move to this current phase, which is this multifaceted approach. We all know this document, the EU-China Outlook in March 2099, when China was labeled by the EU Commission as a partner, competitor, and systemic rival. So the focus was not much anymore on the partner side, but it was more diverse, more controversial, the engagement with China. This has been manifested in many levels. Sorry, 5 minutes, but 30 more seconds. it has been manifested in many levels, that it became more evident also after COVID-19 pandemic, when overdependence of China was very obvious, and then by China's alignment with Russia, even after Russia's aggression against Ukraine. So the strategy shifted. This is not anymore about trying to increase relations with China just by the sake of it, because everything is promising and everything is more like an opportunity, but start to also de-risk for China, not to avoid overdependence of a country that doesn't seem reliable anymore. After the pandemic and after China's alignment with support, indirect support to Russia, invasion of Ukraine. So that's basically, these five stages.
Thank you, Mario, for the very good summary in only 5 minutes. And now that we have this historical background of the EU-China relation, I think it could be useful to explain the different European actors participating in this relation. We have, on one side, the institutions, the European Parliament, the European Commission, and on the other side, we have the member states. So, Finbar, it's your turn now. Can you explain us the differences between these actors and their positions towards China? Not only the difference between the EU institutions and the member states, but also differences among member states that you think are relevant for understanding this broad picture.
Yeah, can you hear me okay? Yeah. So I would break it down to, by the way, thank you for having us here. It's great to be in Barcelona at CEDOP. 3 main actors in sort of operating out of Brussels, where a lot of the laws are made and squabbled over. You've got the European Commission, which is 35,000 civil servants, which sort of proposes policies and puts the meat on the bones. Then you have the European Parliament, made up of elected lawmakers, which haggles with the European Council, made up of the 27 member states. And eventually, they do or they don't come to some sort of a functional or dysfunctional policy, but it can be quite chaotic. I just found out earlier that Josep Borrell is the president of the institution here. When he was the HRV, the High Representative in Brussels, he used to describe it as a cacophony, how policy is made or not made in Brussels on China, because there's so many different things that they fight over. So you've got 27 different member states, combined with all those lawmakers, combined with 35,000 civil servants, it can be a bit of a mess. I'll explain a little bit about the push and pull on that. The Commission has in recent years probably, in my book, become the most influential factor in setting China policy in Europe, possibly because of a sort of political vacuum elsewhere in Europe, weak leadership in Germany, relatively weak leadership in France, and the Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, has sort of moved into that space, into the vacuum, since 2021, over the course of the pandemic, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine especially. And she's, I think we can say she's quite hawkish, she's quite there was, there's that whole question that Henry Kissinger once posed, who do you phone when you need to speak to Europe? And for the last few years, I think the answer has been Ursula von der Leyen. She has collaborated very closely with the Biden administration, and they've sort of been hand in glove in some areas of China policy, and I think she's been quite successful in commandeering the narrative and turning, particularly in Brussels, turning the narrative quite negative. There's been a very sort of dramatic shift since 2021, 2022, and I would say that's largely down to von der Leyen and the Commission. Up until a few months ago, there was not that many people talking in Brussels about engagement with China. You start to see that change a little bit now, and I'm sure we'll get on to that. Other institutions, you've got the European Council made up of the 27 member states, a whole cacophony of its own. 27 different countries is like herding cats when you try to come up to a common position on China, because each of them has their own national interests. Each of them has their own vested trade and investment interests, and they all want to do their own thing, but then at the same time they all have to get in a room and somehow come to a common position. And I think it's why Mario talked about the 2019 designation of China as a partner competitor and rival, which is quite a schizophrenic way of looking at things because they all mean very different things. But I suppose that's the only way you can make a common policy when you have 27 countries all pulling in different directions that have to somehow go the same way. It's always a frustration of me as a journalist covering this because it's such a touchy subject, because they don't agree on much. It's always the first thing when it's on an agenda at a European Council meeting to be kicked off. It's very convenient to sort of boot China off because they know they're not really going to come to any major conclusions that would crack open the Pandora's box of the 2019 triptych. But look, I suppose that's just Europe. The differences in the member states, I mean, this is quite a crude way of putting it, and it's an evolving thing, and it changes from issue to issue. But you do have a sort of, say, like a group of countries that I would say are reliably dovish on China, those who are pro-engagement for very different reasons, led by Germany, which is the biggest economy, has the biggest trading relations with China, and so has always been like the most commanding voice in the room when it comes to sort of maintaining steady trade and investment ties with China. We've started to see that wane a little bit in recent years as sort of, as I said previously, a bit of a vacuum of power in Berlin with a coalition that was very incoherent and really lost a bit of influence in Brussels. Also in that group, it's a bit of a motley crew of countries that really are very different. You would have Hungary, Slovakia, Malta, Cyprus, Greece, all to different extents, and more recently Spain. Very pro-engagement, very much moving to the forefront of those countries that want to do more business and trade, want to invite Chinese investment. And then on the other side, it's a bit of a matter of geography. The further east you go, with notable exceptions like Hungary and Slovakia, the more hawkish countries tend to become. Those countries that are next to Russia in particular, like the Baltic 3, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, much more aligned with the United States when it comes to China policy for two simple reasons. One, they are totally reliant on the United States for security, and so if the United States wants them to be tougher on China in exchange for that guarantee of security, then that's a small price to pay. And then there's also the Russia factor. China's close ties with Russia has made Central Eastern European countries more and more suspicious over the years, more cynical about what China's doing. It has really poisoned large parts of the relationship, I would say. Czech Republic is a little bit of a different case. It sort of has this Havelian foreign policy dating back a long time. It's always had close ties with Taiwan, very strong on human rights, and for that reason has always had quite testy ties with China. But yeah, Germany's the most important one in terms of shaping the narrative on China. It's been a bit sort of AWOL over the last few years, with the new Chancellor coming back now in a coalition that's got off to a bit of a rocky start with losing the first round of votes last week in the Bundestag to become the Chancellor. We'll see whether Merz is able to reassert the German influence. And quickly on the third one, which is the European Parliament. I mean, Parliament's a bit of a madhouse, I would say, as many parliaments are around Europe. It's 2021 when I started doing this job. It was always reliably the most hawkish of all of the institutions. Very much all over the place. Very few of the members of Parliament have an actual background in anything related to China. Quite reactionary, human rights focused. And for various reasons that maybe we will sort of get into later, that relationship has been very poor over the years. I personally think that the Parliament has had an outsized role in shaping EU-China relations, and I would say that's probably China's fault. Because any time there's a debate in the European Parliament that mentions China, the ambassador to the EU ambassador in China gets summoned in Beijing, gets hauled over the coals, and it ends up in this sort of downward spiral where, honestly, if the Chinese government ignored these debates, I would probably be one of the few people in Europe actually watching them. So there wouldn't be a problem. But I think the fact that the Chinese government pays such close attention to what the Parliament is doing and saying, and that informs Chinese policy towards the EU. If they just ignored it, probably nobody else would notice it. It has been playing an outsized role in that over the years, and we've seen that through sanctions and so on. in recent months we see a bit of a thaw in ties between the Parliament and China. Chinese government lifted sanctions on sitting European lawmakers about a month ago, and so we're watching to see whether this is part of a meaningful détente. I'm quite sceptical again, we'll get onto that later, but that's a sort of rough thumbnail sketch to the sort of the division of labour in Brussels.
Thank you. So now we know about the historical background of the relation, the different actors, but we have been talking about that from the European perspective. Now it's interesting to talk about this from the Chinese perspective. So, can you explain to us like the evolution of the Chinese foreign policy towards Europe, and also how this foreign policy differs to the one that China has in other regions in the world?
Yeah, thank you. So I guess we need to differentiate between Europe and the EU a little bit, because when it comes to multilateral organizations, be it like global governance, institutions like the UN or the regional ones, I think China has a very pragmatic approach to these institutions, unlike the EU or Europe, let's say, that has a more normative or like value-laden approach in terms of transnational regimes. So China prefers bilateral or minilateral, at least, over multilateral, not only towards the EU, but all other regional organizations, basically, be it the African Union or Mercosur or others. But if you look at like a China-Europe relations in general, including the EU, of course, Mario already explained the reversal over the last 4 decades or so, right? From Europe being almost like one of the first points of contacts for China in the opening up, reintegration into the global economy. Like Germany, for example, I'm talking about Germany, it was like almost a second after the Chinese Americans investing in China, right? So it's like, you know, Europeans were first to go invest in China and bring the technology and skills and everything. And over the 4 decades, we see like a reversal of this relationship and reversal of the balance of power as well. Okay, is it better? Is it better if I maybe hold it? Is it good? Okay. So does it mean that you didn't hear anything I said so far? I can just continue. Okay, so I was talking about this like reversal of the roles and the balance of power. Now Europe is actually asking China to bring in investment, but also bring the technology and the skills, the know-how transfer and skills upgrading, right? So in these 4 decades, China has become an economic superpower with political implications. And that change is related to China's relations with other parts of the world, right? So China is coming from a background of one of the third world countries, right, from the Cold War years, and from being a fellow third world country in the Cold War years, now it has a like a hierarchically superior, if I may, relationship with what we now call the global South, right? But the current state of global economy actually gives the global South countries a certain amount of leverage that they are not passive recipients of investments or aid from superpowers, be it United States, traditionally Europe, not anymore that much, but now more recently China. But they have actually a bargaining power vis-a-vis these superpowers, old and new, and they can actually pick and choose among this battle of offers, right? From the United States, from China, from Europe to a lesser extent. So what is happening, in my opinion, is Europe is both a competitor of China in the global south, or some say it's like plural south, or the global majority, right? Who can pick and choose from these different offers. And most recently, with all the tariff wars that the US initiated, and Europe and the EU is still on the fence about like how much they're going to take along with the US protectionism, or if they're going to actually engage with China in a more nuanced way. In this sense, Europe is again, as I said, a competitor in third countries or regions, so like Africa, for example. The Global Gateway, for example, is a mechanism that is designed to compete with the Belt and Road Initiative of China. But while being competitor as an investor and aid provider, it is also one of the recipients of China's investment and technology transfer at the same time. So it is, it can be grouped in a way with other regions at the same time. So in this sense, China's foreign policy towards Europe has evolved from one that is dependent on Europe's investment and technology, and therefore one that's a position that needs to be in good terms with Europe when it comes to transnational issues, for example, to a position that like China is the provider of investment and technology and doesn't have to give in a way, to Europe's normative requests, can actually negotiate these normative requests, both in terms of development, for example, the political conditionalities that comes with development aid, or other international, transnational issues like human rights regimes, for example, right? China is now in a position to redefine, or at least request, demand to redefine what is basic human rights, for example, right? So that puts Europe in an uneven position vis-a-vis China, I think. Yeah.
Thank you. Now that we have like a broad picture, we can jump to more current debates. So, Finbar, I think these past weeks, months, have been very busy, exhausting, I don't know how to define it, as a correspondent. Horrible, okay. So, as you were saying before, after the Trump victory, we have seen a change in rhetoric, in symbolic gestures, like between the EU and China. But I think it will be very useful if you can explain what has been happening this past week, what has been the main events, gestures, like exchanges that have happened, and why they are important, and maybe they show that something is changing in the relationship between the EU and China.
Yeah. I should caveat it or like put at the very front of this that nobody actually knows what's going on. So my guess is as good as anybody's. I mean, this is a problem of trying to analyze or report on anything in the age of Donald Trump. Whatever I'm saying could be out of date by the time I finish the sentence. To set the scene, things were so bad between the EU and China last October. I mean, towards the third quarter, fourth quarter of last year was an all-time low. At that time, I was telling anybody who would listen to me that there's no way that things will improve, because the relationship has just got to such a negative place. I really struggled to see how even Donald Trump would sort of manage to put the EU and China together again. That's what happened in 2017 when Trump first came around. The EU and China basically patched up their differences, and there was a sort of a détente. Pretty soon after Trump came back in January, and he was like going around the place talking about taking Greenland and all sorts of crazy stuff. We did notice quite soon after like a shift in tone, even from the sort of the most hawkish factions in Europe, like Ursula von der Leyen and her sort of like trade chief, Šefčovič. They started talking about, well, maybe we can deepen trade and investment ties with China. And if you had listened to a word that she said over the previous 3 years, this was a shock, you know, because it was just such a radical, small rhetorical change, but radically different from what she was saying like 6 months earlier. And from the Chinese side, we saw some early maneuvers at like big events. Like I was in Munich for a big security conference in February, and we were all watching as the Chinese foreign minister was meeting with a procession of his European counterparts. I was shocked, for example, when he met with the Czech foreign minister, Jan Lipavsky, who is one of the biggest hawks in Europe. And at that point I was thinking, okay, things are changing a little bit. You know, if Lipavsky's meeting Wang Yi, that's different. You know, it's a little bit different. This was what was described to me at the time as a little bit the foothills of a charm offensive from China, very much testing the water to see what was the sort of response in Europe. One official told me at the time that they were just coming to rub their noses in the fact that the United States had abandoned Europe. It wasn't really a charm offensive, it was just sort of coming to laugh. So that was early on. It was very much baby steps. Since then, I would say that we've noticed one concession on each side, and we'll only know how notable it is, I suppose, in the passage of time. They seem quite symbolic to me, but like they do represent each side giving a little bit of something. On the EU side first, you know, they have this almost annual summit between the EU and China, and it's supposed to rotate. It's supposed to be in Beijing one year and then Brussels or somewhere in Europe the next year. For a few years during COVID, it was all online. This year, it's the EU's turn to host it. But because Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, refused to come to Brussels, the EU leaders decided they would go to Beijing. And that's a concession, because obviously the optics aren't great from a European perspective. It looks like we're just deciding to go to China because this guy can't be bothered to come to Europe, even though he was, by the way, in Russia just last week. He told them he wasn't coming to Europe this year, which is not technically true. But that's a concession. The logic from Brussels' point of view was you can't get anything done with the current Chinese government unless you go right to the top of the tree. So it's a sort of form of pragmatism, I suppose, as well. And on the Chinese side, we had the dropping of sanctions on some of the lawmakers who were sanctioned in 2021. This was part of a tit-for-tat exchange of sanctions related to human rights abuses in Xinjiang, the region in the west of China. Again, this was quite low-hanging fruit from the Chinese perspective. They could have done this any point over the last 4 years. The fact that they've decided to do it now is very interesting. It shows that there is maybe a little bit of give in the Chinese system. But I suppose what we're all looking out for now is whether this is the extent of the concessions that Beijing is willing to make, or whether that's the tip of the iceberg, whether there's more to come. We'll be watching out for that. I mean, I suppose we'll get into what Europe maybe wants from China afterwards, unless you want me to go into that now. Well, yeah, I think like from the European perspective, what they want from China is, I don't know which is more unrealistic. They want China to change its relationship with Russia, which I think doesn't look like it's going to happen. And they also want China to do something about its economic system, which is probably equally unlikely. But there's discussions underway about, so Trump's huge trade tariffs on China, 145% they were last week. They've come right down to around a 40% effective rate now. There is some fear in Europe that will cause Chinese goods that cannot get into the United States to be redirected to Europe, and local companies in Europe will be under pressure because there's sort of cheaper goods coming in from China. And so this is a real fear for, when I speak to folks in Brussels, they're very worried about what they describe as this trade diversion. They want the Chinese to agree to some sort of a system to monitor this, which is, interesting, we'll see. It's creative. And there's also big concerns about the build-up of industrial surpluses in the Chinese economy. Basically, they say China is making too much stuff, and they don't like where this stuff's coming from because it comes from subsidies in the system and all this. So they want China to do something about those areas, and they also want China to invest in Europe in electric vehicle, battery supply chain and stuff like that. So those are the demands. Whether China is willing to give anything on those, we'll soon see. Maybe in the coming weeks before the summit, there might be some movement. But yeah, I suppose those two concessions are where we are. The rest is noise, symbolism. But look, they pay me to monitor all those little bits and pieces and see where the pieces fall.
As you were saying, like these symbols nowadays, like compared to the previous situations,
yeah, I mean, it's super interesting, and it's all like the mood music is incredibly different to what it was 4 or 5 months ago. Really, you couldn't have paid somebody in Brussels to say a good word about China like last year. And now people are open to maybe we shouldn't be falling out with China, and it's a sort of reaction, I think, to what's going on the other side of the Atlantic. It's purely, I mean, there's only one variable that has changed in the meantime. China hasn't changed, Europe hasn't really changed, America has changed. Yeah. So this has inspired like a sea change, certainly in the atmospherics. And again, I'm a little bit reluctant to get carried away about the substance, because I think they're quite big asks, and I don't know whether the system in China is set up to make such concessions, but we'll see.
Well, now that we are talking about changes, I think it could be interesting to focus on the case of a particular member state of the EU, Spain, that, I mean, although Spain has traditionally had a more friendly position towards China, its public posture in the past was generally discreet and in line with the European Commission. But what we have seen in the past months is that now the government of Pedro Sánchez wants to position itself as a more prominent voice shaping the public debate about China in Europe. So, Mario, many people are wondering about what is happening, why is this change happening? So, can you explain that to us, please?
Okay. Yeah. Well, I'll try, and I'm going also to take advantage of some of the things that Finbar has mentioned before. Distinguish between the narrative, and the diplomatic dimension of these Spain-China relations and the actual content of the Spain strategy towards China. I think we should distinguish a little bit between that. First, the Sánchez government has been quite consistent in trying to increase relations with China from a pragmatic perspective. He visited China 2023, 2024, and also quite recently, also this year, 2025. And what he's been trying to do is actually to increase, the presence of China in areas that could be of interest to Spain. He looks for Chinese investment. He looks for Chinese technology. To some extent, the feeling is that Spain is trying to take advantage of the window of opportunity to upgrade economic relations with China in a way that other big European economies have done longer before Spain. Actually, if you look at the figures, trade, investment, it's pretty obvious that among the biggest EU economies, Spain is by far the one which lower dependence, lower exposition to China. So this is the context in which this policy is being taking place. And also, Finbar mentioned before, we have like in this hawkish, dovish kind of a spectrum, Spain actually is in the middle. If you look at the voting on the EV tariffs in October last year, Spain was one of the 12 countries that abstained voted for abstention, which was, by the way, the mainstream position, 10 in favor, 12 abstaining, and 5 against, And actually Spain shifted previously, because previously Spain was in support of the tariffs. He shifted from abstaining for supporting the tariffs to abstention, So it's not a very dovish kind of approach. And also, if you look, at the 3-year action plan that has been just released, right, quite recently after Sánchez visit to Beijing last month, and if you look at the content of that 3-year action plan, and you compare it with the 3-year action plan subscribed by the Meloni government with China, the year before in 2024, actually you will see that the Spanish 3-year action plan is even less ambitious than the Italian action plan. So this idea, that actually the Spanish policy towards China is kind of extraordinary or is super dovish or pro-engagement. Okay, yes, but because also Spain has reviewed his investment screening mechanism, he's increased his measure on scientific security. He has passed already a legislation on exports of dual use technology. So actually Spain is not that dovish, Nevertheless, it's completely true what you said here before, and this is the dimension, that the narrative is very pro-engagement. And this is, I think, is the big difference between Sánchez and maybe other, not all European leaders, because as Finbar mentioned before, there are more dovish kind of countries in the EU. But I think the main difference is that Sánchez, he's quite open to publicly, support and embrace engagement with China, and this is really, a different tune. That we have heard before, by main European leaders, by the European Commission, and so on and so forth.
Seren, you have done research on Chinese foreign policy, including the Belt and Road Initiative, and also about the EU's global gateway, like the response to the Belt and Road. So what do you think has been the impact and interaction of these two initiatives in the European neighborhood, let's say North Africa, the Western Balkans, the South Caucasus, and more broadly, how does the EU and China see each other and interact in countries in the global South?
Thank you. Yeah, I would like to start with BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, a little bit, because I think there is a global, almost like misconception about what BRI is. One misconception, I think, misperception is that it is a concrete plan. Like, it's sometimes called like China's Marshall Plan, right? Alluring to the Cold War ideological economic plan of the US, that it is plans to be the same from the very beginning, very coherent, very centralized and everything, which is not the case actually. BRI has started merely as an extension of domestic development plans to help to support the development of the historically underdeveloped regions of China. And the overseas extension was, in the earlier stages, was to actually help the state-owned enterprises to avoid bankruptcy and, support the domestic development. And at that stage, there were a lot of wasteful investments in the regions like Africa and Latin America and to a lesser extent Central Asia as well, mostly in the construction sector. I'm sure you heard about like the stadiums and the convention centers and everything in the countries that don't have running water, right? So all these like excessive construction investments that were wasteful with no added value to the local employment, local labor markets or industrial development. But then, and that actually colors the global and European perception of what BRI is. And it is often called a debt trap, right? But then in around mid-2010s, the Chinese government repurposed the BRI for its own industrial upgrading. As a channel, as a mechanism for China to develop its own domestic markets, first in digital and green sectors, and then to dominate the consumer markets in digital and green sectors, well, pretty much all over the world, right? So BRI was aligned with the Made in China 2025 industrial upgrading strategy in China, and after that, actually, BRI has become something else. Then it became something more targeted and focused on more value-added investments projects in the target countries. And after that, we cannot really talk about this debt trap diplomacy anymore. And I'm going to come back to actually circle back to what Mario was talking about, like Spain's position in that. So if you look at Europe's, the greater European neighborhoods, we see China has a very targeted approach to several sub-regions in Europe and around Europe. In Europe, Central and Eastern European countries, the CE countries are one target region. And in the greater European neighborhoods, Eastern Mediterranean is another target region, including the Gulf region, North Africa, Morocco, Egypt, to a lesser extent Lebanon and Israel because of political instability. And it is, and if you think of this geography, Spain is right in the middle of these two regions, right? So I think that's very relevant to like this Spain's new engagement strategy with China, because Spain in particular and Southern Europe in general is in a position to attract this value-added projects, investments within the framework of the BRI much better than the CE countries within the EU, Central Eastern European countries, and definitely the southern neighborhoods, the MENA countries. So I think, and I'm happy to discuss this more with the audience, but this is what Spain is aiming at, and I think it's you know, the analysis is correct there. And so this is what I think China's BRI is doing in the greater European neighborhood. If I just like maybe add something about the Global Gateway. So Global Gateway started as the European alternative to the Belt and Road Initiative, but lacking the centralized decision-making for that, and also the ambivalence about what it actually is about. And that goes back to Finbar's point about like different EU institutions having different agendas and, you know, having their own internal, you know, power struggles and everything. So it had this ambivalence about if it is going to be yet another, maybe more powerful tool for development aid for the EU, or is it going to be actually a tool for European competitiveness? And it seems like in this debate, the competitiveness camp seemed to be winning over the development camp, meaning that we will see more, less of political conditionality in the Global Gateway's selection of flagship projects, and a more transactional approach, whatever serves the European private sector, basically, in the target countries. So in this sense, it is getting maybe closer to the BRI, but I think there's still, at least in Brussels, maybe the member states have a better understanding of what the BRI is, but at least in Brussels, I think there's still a lack of understanding about what the BRI is and how the new generation BRI projects are very targeted in digital and renewable sectors, and there's like much less a chance of project failure or bankruptcy. There's still this conversation in Brussels about how BRI is about that trap, and the European projects have the capacity to offer better deals to the target countries. But I personally am very doubtful about that because the Global Gateway hasn't figured out its how to mobilize the private sector, because China, it is not a top-down, as top-down as it is perceived from outside. It's not like Xi Jinping tells the SOEs or the private companies to go invest here and there. There's, room for company decision, definitely, but still, having a national industrial plan actually helps China to shape and channel certain investments, which is not the case for a global gateway. The EU needs to convince the private sector to actually join the global gateway and do these targeted investments in the partner countries, and we don't have the fiscal mechanisms to actually encourage the private sector to do that. And there's another good analysis of where China is present in the priority areas of global gateway, which is Africa and Latin America, and where the European private sector can have a competitive advantage in these two regions. And plus, the Asian partners of the EU, both in Northeast Asia, but especially in Southeast Asia, ASEAN countries, feel neglected in the global gateway. It's also another issue. So just to wrap up, Global Gateway, and we are going to have a forum, Global Gateway Forum. It was going to be in June, and it's now suddenly postponed to October, so we'll see what's going to come out of this forum. But it is trying to reinvent itself like a European BRI, but I think we still have a long way to go before that. Yeah. Without the money. That's a good way of putting it, yeah.
So I have a last question for all of you, and then we can jump to questions from the participants here. Over the past years, a decisive factor in worsening the EU-China relation has been the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the close relationship between Moscow and Beijing. For many Central and Eastern European countries, like Russia has been the main factor through which they analyze, perceive, and see China. But now, with Trump adopting a more pro-Russian stance and criticizing Zelensky, etc., we have seen something that it has been very unusual. That is, traditionally pro-American Eastern European countries, such as Poland and the Baltics, directly criticizing Trump and criticizing the US. So my question for all of you is, do you think Trump's new Ukraine policy could bring changes in how the EU and also Central and Eastern European countries perceive China? So you can start. If you want.
Maybe a contrarian view. I think it's going to make it worse.
Okay.
Because if the United States backs out totally from supporting Ukraine, Europe is on the hook for financing the war. So the Russia-China relationship comes even more intensely under the microscope. They're already analyzing closely the sort of provision of dual-use goods, civil, military, from China to Russia. And I think that, I suppose, in a logical way, the Europeans, United States pulling out maybe would reduce the sort of animosity towards China from Europe, but I think it might have the opposite effect. I think even if there's a ceasefire, whatever that looks like, I think in Europe they're going to be studying very closely to see what happens with the Russian military in that time. Is there going to be a big uptick in trade between China to Russia as Russia tries to rebuild its forces? So it may be a contrarian view that I don't see this improving. I think that the damage has been done, and I fear that regardless of what the actual outcome is, it's going to, unless there's some unexpected scenario where China plays a really productive role in bringing the war to an end, I don't think it has a seat at the table. But I'd be surprised on the upside if that happens. But my sense is that this is not going to be going great.
So, Mario?
Agree with Theodore, but I also think that I agree with this long-term or more structural analysis, that he made, but maybe I'd like to add two things, One is that depending on what Trump does, also we can see some ups and downs, ups and downs,
bilateral relationship. Although at the end of the day, I think that it may be even worse. And also a second caveat is that I don't think if in the short terms things get better in Ukraine, the salience of the Ukrainian issue, it would change for some member states, because even now, even the member states that are not that close to Russia, even them, they give, even for them, is Chinese support, indirect support to Russia is a significant issue in shaping bilateral relations. But if things go better in Ukraine, at least in the short term, medium term, those countries that are not that close to Russia, for those countries, the Ukraine factor is going to be that relevant anymore. So it could help to bring closer relations between those countries, and China. Although again, I'm seeing these two little caveats, but I really quite agree, with what Fiumba said, for the big picture.
Listen to this, when it comes to contrarian views. I know that I'm an absolute minority in Brussels saying that, but I'm going to say it anyways. I think looking from China's foreign policy rationale, China and Russia are not close, tight ideological allies. China has a very pragmatic approach to Russia, trying to contain Russia, actually seeing it. China sees itself as a superpower now and sees Russia as a very problematic regional power. So it is not China and Russia together versus the US and the US allies. Everything China does, and of course it includes some arms support to Russia, trades, some trade it withdrew, but some continues, and the symbolic diplomatic gestures like going to Moscow, for example, for the Victory Day and everything are there, but they are a part of damage control, again, to contain Russia and to preventing it from further damaging China's economic economic engagements. I think the EU would benefit from not putting Russia and China in the same baskets and try to actually decouple China from Russia in economic or diplomatic ways as much as possible. And in a similar fashion, I also find something related to this, that China-Russia alliance problematic that is very common in Brussels. So there's this saying in Brussels that Ukraine now, Taiwan tomorrow. That's if we lose Ukraine, next day it will be Taiwan, and a full Chinese invasion of Taiwan will be detrimental to European economic interests, at least, if not, immediate military interests. I think China wouldn't puts Ukraine and Taiwan together, and there is no like a direct equation or relationship between the fate of Ukraine, as you said, like after the Trump era, and what may or may not happen in Taiwan. And in any case, there are reports that even anything short of a full invasion of Taiwan is not that costly for Europe. Again, that's also, I think, yet another motivation for Europe not to put Russia and China or push China towards Russia and try to actually, again, decouple these two from each other. Yeah.
So now we can open the discussion. So if anyone has any question, and if they ask in Spanish, you can use this.
Thank you. I have a couple questions. First, perhaps to Maria, and also to Javier, right? So, we talked about Spain actually compared with other European large economies, the economic dependence on China has been low. And that's true when we look at the Chinese investment in Europe. Spain has not been the top destination, right? It's Germany, Northern European countries have been the top recipients of Chinese FDIs. So the question is, why that has been the case? And do you see that changing, right? Do you see changing policy on either side or changing the economic structures on either side that will make Spain a more attractive destination for Chinese investment? And then question to Finbar is, do you detect any change in rhetoric or policy in Germany, right? So I feel like China and Germany kind of has had a sort of bad romance relationship for the last few years, where there are multiple times it seems that the romance has turned bad, and we thought during Merkel, during Scholz, Germany was waking up from its addiction, but that has turned out not to be the case. Do you detect any change in immerse, right? And final question, forgive me, for Seren is, so you are saying that China is really, its support for Russia is symbolic, not substantive, and Europe should not kind of blame China for its bromance with Russia. So how do you interpret Xi Jinping's talk with Putin, say, the world is experiencing changes we haven't seen in 100 years, and it's you and I who are gonna make the direction, basically, forge a new order from this change?
So we can go in order. So Mario, you can.
Okay.
Sí, pero responden a esta y después responden a esta serie de preguntas y después pasamos a Kevin. So,
Shall I go? Shall I go?
Can you hear me? Yes, you can go now, Mario.
Okay, thank you. Okay, well, I think there are a few reasons explaining why Spain hasn't been before like one of the main destinations for Chinese investment, and why that could, and why now, it could be a much more attractive destination. Well, first, actually, China has been more interested in investing in Spain, in brownfield investment in Spain in the past than what the figures show. But what happened is that Spain has had in practice for a very long time his own FDI screening mechanism, and some investments that China may have had potential interest in doing in Spain, and it has done in other, for example, Mediterranean countries, like big ports in Greece or electric companies, in Portugal, that kind of investment was out of the table, for the Spanish government, and it has enforced the mechanisms to prevent those kind of operations, So when some Chinese investors were interested in the past in that kind of investment, they approach, in a low profile way, and behind the curtains way, some Spanish stakeholders to let know their interest, and they were rejected. So that's part of the reasons, But it's also important to keep in mind that now we talk about, it was mentioned before, we are talking about the automotive sector, we are talking about renewable sector, and in those areas, Spain, is quite it's quite relevant, it's quite attractive destination for investment. So it's a good fit, it's a good match. And also now we live in a context in which geopolitical risk is playing a more important role than in the past. And unlike in many other EU member states, in Spain, the only political parties that could lead a government, they are quite pro-engagement with China. So this means that even if there are changes, in the ruling party in the country, this pro-engagement approach with China could be quite stable. So geopolitical risk or country risk is lower in Spain, than in other main EU member states. So I think this other reason, for Spain being now a more attractive destination for Chinese investment than in the past.
Feeding off scraps at the moment, we just had the first major foreign policy speech by Friedrich Merz in the Bundestag yesterday. One thing that was picked up was that he referred to China mainly as a rival. He did say it's a partner on the big challenges of the day, but he really focused in his short intervention on China on the fact that it's, he said twice, a systemic rival. He talked about the need to do strategic de-risking. I think it was a little bit more sort of forthright than maybe people would have expected. But look, believe it when I see it, because every chancellor is basically held hostage by the German automotive industry. So I'd be shocked if there was a major change in Germany. As you said, Jan May, there's been several instances in the past when it seemed like German chancellors, they have a habit of saying we're no longer naive on China, and then filling a plane full of corporate executives and flying over to Beijing and signing lots of deals. I mean, that's the pressure on the chancellor. Like, the industry there's a revolving door in the chancellor's office. So again, like, it's just breadcrumbs at the moment. The rhetoric is slightly different to what we saw under Schulz, but I'd be surprised if it was a major change. But let's see.
Thank you for the opportunity to explain how I reached this conclusion about China-Russia relationship. So all these official statements, diplomatic maneuvers, like the big words, it's you and me against the rest of the world kind of things, are words, they are necessary for Chinese both domestic consumption and also to maintain the official foreign policy discourse. But when you look at the substance of the relationship, when you follow the money, as as the saying goes, for example, when Russia invaded Ukraine, in the immediate months, a lot of Chinese banks and SOEs withdrew their investments from either financial support or investments from China in fear of secondary sanctions on China, right? So China looks like a very extremely top-down system, but actually these economic actors have a say, both in domestic decision-making and international decision-making as well. So that fear was real, right? And when we look at the China-Russia relationship throughout these years during the invasion of Ukraine, in other parts of the world, we see that the relationship is actually far from these really tight alliance. Look at Shanghai Cooperation Organization, for example, or BRICS. It's even more visible that China basically has taken over BRICS over these years. The last enlargement was all the countries that would help China's, going back to my previous point about BRI, it's BRI strategy, right? All these Middle Eastern countries, all China's choice. And all the countries that Russia proposed to have in BRICS, China overruled the proposition immediately without even giving grace or giving face, to Russia. So that, I think, indicates a very uneven relationship when we look at the relationship as a whole, not only about Ukraine. And going back to, again, the point of these official statements, every time Putin and Xi meet, or it doesn't have to be the top leadership, but top leadership in general Russia meet, we should look at the difference between the Russian and Chinese readouts of the meeting. They're always different. The Russian readout is always like, reinforcing the idea that China and Russia are so tight and like they're acting together, they're anti-American and everything. But the Chinese readout says, yeah, we talked, and we have some agreements and we have our disagreements. It's a much more subtle and nuanced language. And of course, they do for their own reasons, right? Because China is, as I said, trying to manage damage control, whereas Russia needs the legitimacy of Chinese supports to continue, to be able to continue the invasion. So that's why I think it's a very uneven and loose relationship. Looser than we think in Europe, let's say, at least. Yeah.
Yo quisiera preguntar una cosa bastante concreta.
I wanted to ask a specific question. In the South China Morning Post this morning, there was a piece of news according to which the Chinese government will pay a significant amount of money to Chinese students, Chinese origin students, who are carrying out research in the United States. This is a program. China was not the only country doing it. In Spain, this was already done. There was one already. It's been reinforced and strengthened. There's such programs in other European countries. Sometimes it's like a raffle because one offers 5 million, the next one offers 8 million. But since you work in the South China Morning Post, do you have any more details regarding this? What does this entail? Do you have any more information? Because the piece of news just was that, nothing more.
Thank you, Javier. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, CIDOB, for organizing this interesting panel. I wanted to ask about cities. So another political unit that has relations that are growing in European cities and Chinese cities, and city diplomacy as a way. Yes. Okay. European city diplomacies to Chinese cities. In Barcelona since 1988, Maragall signed MOU with Shanghai. Then in 2001, Barcelona and Shanghai has a sister cities agreement. In 2003, there was also an agreement with Guangzhou, and in 2021, Barcelona has another sister cities agreement with Shenzhen. So 2 sister cities agreement, and the relationships are growing. And also as an example of this city diplomacy, in the Mobile World Congress, there are more than 300 Chinese companies, Huawei by large, but also other companies like CTE and Xiaomi. And in Barcelona, in the same place, there are American companies and Chinese companies coming together. So my point is that in economic and investment relations, but I think in all international relations, cities may open ways that maybe member states, for political reasons or for historical reasons or for geopolitical reasons, cannot breach. And I wanted to ask you about these city diplomacies, if you can have insights on that, and if you are aware of other European capitals that have interest in growing its influence towards Chinese cities. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very interesting remarks. In light of what we hear today, my question would be thus. it's a bit of summary question, I guess, but we talk a little bit about how oftentimes we in Europe do not necessarily understand China. You gave this example how a Belt and Road Initiative is framed in the sense what we can offer as Europe as an alternative vis-a-vis the Global South in general. So my general question to all of you speakers is, what is your assessment of the European expertise on China within Brussels institutions? And I ask this question, for instance, in the context of the concept that was loudly announced 2 years ago by the European Commission, that there will be China Fellowship to significantly deepen the understanding of China. And I was trying to follow up on that last year. There was silence. We don't know what to do. We don't yet know how this is going to continue after the first year. So I guess my question is, how do you assess the level of expertise within the European institutions in terms of decision-making vis-a-vis China? And if your assessment would be that this can be improved, then how can we meaningfully improve that? Because this is going to be a lasting expertise needed. And I'm asking myself this question basically based on this China Fellowship, loudly announced by the European Commission, but at least to my understanding, less active now. So thank you very much.
Really short answer to your question. I'm sorry, I haven't seen the story. But if we can talk afterwards and I can try and find out more. And if you give me your details, I can share what I found out with the journalist who wrote the story. But I'm sorry, I haven't seen the news story that you mentioned. Can I just answer this lady on the fellowship? From what I know, and Sharon, you may know more than me, it seems as though it's been, in a way, discontinued. So there were 5 fellows, I think, initially. This is at DG IDEA. A handful of them, I think there are 2 left. 3 of them have left, and I don't think that they're hiring anymore. Well, I don't think so. I mean, that was. Do you know, Sharon? I don't think they are. But I mean, to the sort of broader question about the expertise, I think there are some really good people in the institutions and in and around the institutions, but I think there's quite a shallow pool. And I think it's not just in Brussels, it's in Europe-wide. I mean, I was using the example earlier. I'm from Ireland and speaking at a conference in Ireland last year about like contemporary Chinese geopolitics with an Irish academic who's a historian of Shanghai in the 1920s. And she's the person that Irish journalists go to with their questions about modern China, because we just have such a lack of expertise, and it's a problem because the China issue, for good and for bad, is you know, it's a big one, and we need to know more about China, and it's a shame that there isn't more expertise. I know some very good young sinologists. There seems to be a decent pipeline, but maybe not enough. But how do you incentivize people to I guess, specialize in China whenever the reputation of China has taken such a battering in Europe, whenever the biggest think tank in Europe that deals with China is under sanctions by the Chinese government? It's a very tough sell, I suppose. I don't know what the answer is, but we need more.
Well, if I can add something on this issue about European expertise or EU expertise on China, I think that another key point, you know, besides reputation issues, is that learning Chinese takes a lot of time. You know, so you need to offer, you know, significant incentives, you know, for people to do that. And also, I think that a worrisome situation, it was that till, let's say, before the COVID-19 pandemic, you know, even I fully agree with Finbar, this idea there was a shallow pool, but, you know, the pool was increasing, you know. But and you see, you know, there were some prospects, you know, for things to go in the good direction. But after the pandemic, after the increased deterioration of China's reputation in Europe, and also, you know, growing administrative, you know, sometimes barriers, you know, for European. Now it's changed. This one thing that I'm going to say now it has changed, but, you know, I mean, until quite recently, it's changed to some extent. It's becoming more and more difficult for foreign researchers to conduct research on China, particularly on, let's say, some sensitive issues. You know, when I was conducting my PhD in China, you know, it was like long time ago. You know, like was like my fieldwork there was like, well, over 20 years ago, okay? And at that time, things were relatively okay, you know, but now things are more complicated. So there are a few developments that make things more difficult, you know, and I think that's a pity, because even you know, the reputation of China is obviously decreasing in Europe. The relevance for China is obviously increasing, you know, in the world, you know, for Europe. So it's really needed, you know, this kind of expertise.
Thank you. Let me start with the expertise and the city diplomacy and the students' question, though students' questions kind of relate to expertise. But so for
quickly, because we want to take a couple more questions.
Okay, okay, super quick. So the China expertise in Brussels. So we do have China experts in Brussels, not as many as the US has in DC. Definitely much smaller crowds, but like well versed in you know, Chinese politics and everything. And also among the decision makers, the offices that are directly related to China has this, like, you know, accumulated knowledge and experience with China. But my impression is that this is so much siloed, like they are like in their own China circles, and the other experts in the think tanks, research institutions, and also among the decision makers in institutions in other offices don't know much about China, but you cannot talk about China without talking about digitalization, for example, right? Or like industrial transformation, or like cybersecurity. You know, all these issues need to be talked, like, you know, in dialogue with China, and this is not happening, is my impression, yeah. For Brussels. And for the city diplomacy, totally agree. Like subnational level engagements are really important, because again, I'm just like repeating myself here, but like China is not Xi Jinping, right? So there are a lot of other actors, and the local governments, local businesses, local capital, local civil society actors do matter in China too. So actually subnational level engagement is very important. Like the Barcelona port negotiations is a good example, actually, like, you know, negotiating to have a better share from BRI besides the Valencia port, right? Or Duisburg, similarly, the Duisburg port is actually a success story for the Chinese diaspora in Duisburg, Germany, right?
Yeah. Huh? They sold the terminal last year, I think, Costco.
Yeah, but that's what the Chinese diaspora played an important role there. So it's, you know, so yeah, I agree. And with that, the Chinese students' question, well, I didn't read the article either, and I was like hearing the question through translation, so I'm not sure if I understood the point of the news article this morning, but I took it as the countries or the EU sending students to China to study in China, right? If I'm understanding correctly,
the other way around, I think it was
Chinese.
It is a program to attract Chinese-born researchers in the United States to return to China.
I see, like kind of a reverse brain drain kind of a situation, and this is happening in Europe too.
Yeah, it's happening in Europe. It is, but in Europe, it has to stand the opposition of the strong syndicates in the universities who don't look in who don't like the idea of all those people coming back with salaries higher than them. But I think that in China, probably this problem will not be the same, and it will be much easier to reinsert all those people if they want to come back, which I don't know. Many years ago, they didn't want to come back, but now I have heard that many people come back to China because there are.
Well, I think the US and Europe will lose these brains.
I don't know the importance of the movement. Well, that's what
to be honest, like,
I don't know.
if I was a Chinese researcher in the United States, I would probably
go back, right?
Europe should be trying to attract the Chinese researchers from the United States.
Though I don't know if they will be happy in China, like given the political pressures on Chinese universities in China.
Get them to come to Europe.
Let's take a couple final questions. There was two there.
Very short one. Do you personally believe that China is a systemic rival for the European Union or not? Very easy.
Okay, to get back on the Global Gateway Initiative, we have talked about how it's a very limited project and how it has recycled the budget even and projects. But I think it's a window of opportunity, or at least the European Union is considering as an important move. So I was wondering about, from a more optimistic perspective, if you think the global gateway is obsolete, or does it have a possibility to be reformed and to actually be useful, or even in cooperation with the Belt and Road? Do you see this possibility? And also, what is the perspective from China of the Global Gateway Initiative? Because I haven't read much about that. Thank you.
If you can answer.
Yeah, but there's like one last question, so we'll take that.
Well, okay,
yeah.
Very quick.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us, by the way. I really appreciate that. I just wanted to double check on what Finbar said, which is very interesting. So, by the way, my family's from Germany. I was born in Germany, but I was raised in the US. So I have this kind of hybrid in my head every time. And we know that Trump is very unpredictable, right? So in the US, people behave more like putting on a show because it sounds great. Right, so that's what Americans do. I feel like Germans are always more reactive. And what you said is very interesting to me. So just Trump came up with the tariffs. Okay, everybody's in shock. Ursula von der Leyen all of a sudden changes her approach a little bit on stage, saying something completely different than 6 months ago. But now I'm thinking to myself, okay, let's say Trump's term is off, like it's gone in like 2 years, if he's not changing the Constitution or for something. Right? So he's going to be gone. Do you believe that based on the people that he's putting into position right now, that it's going to continue like that? And that's the reason why Ursula von der Leyen thinks, okay, we got to think long-term now. We have to be more engaged with China. Or is it just more being naive right now, thinking, oh my God, we got to do something short-term because Trump is in office right now. So how do you see the future? Because if they agree to something that they want to do with China now, and then Trump is gone and think everything comes back to normal because the Democrats are going to be in office again, how do you want to reverse all of that if you want to? Doesn't make any sense what I'm trying to say. It's a long question, I got it. But I appreciate it. I got it.
Last question. I mean, I don't think that even if Trump's gone, I don't think that the US will reverse course on China. I mean, it's the one issue that the Democrats and Republicans agree on. They try to be who can be the biggest hawk on China. It was quite telling that when Biden was in office, he actually continued and expanded upon Trump's policies. He made them more sort of less flexible. They were more rigid. He enshrined them in a more sort of like legalistic way than what Trump ever did. I mean, you see how Trump operates. It operates as tariff on, tariff off. You know, it's very sort of whimsical and capricious way of governing. So I don't think that that's the case. I personally don't believe that Ursula von der Leyen believes in the re-engagement with China. I think that there's a lot of messaging going on there and signaling, both to the United States to show that Europe has options, both to China as well, to say, look, make us an offer, you know, make us an offer we can't refuse. But also I think the third prong was messaging to the Germans, because this was going on in the German electoral campaign. So I think it was also a signal to the conservative base in Germany to say, look, we're not totally radical hawks here, you know, we can sort of go a steady line. You know, I go back to the baseline that I don't think there will be a meaningful rapprochement between the EU and China, so I don't know that, you know, I think that things are on a certain track, that the mood music is a bit better, I think the tone will improve a little bit, but I don't think there will be huge changes, so I'm not sure there will be too much to unpick. On the question from the guy at the back, I mean, systemic rival, I suppose if you think that your systems are rivals, like sort of authoritarian communist system versus liberal democracy, I would say yes, that we are systemic rivals. China and the Chinese government sees the world in a very different way than how many European governments see things on human rights, on democracy. So yeah, I mean, I think in a literal, definitive sense of the word, or the term, yeah, we're systemic rivals. That can be extrapolated, I suppose. People can put a subjective analysis on how you apply that, but in the very meaning of the word, as a non-expert, a non-sort of like academic, I guess so.
Mm-hmm. Mario?
Okay, on the systemic rival question, yes, but not only because we have different political or economic systems, but also because in some areas it's very obvious that our proposals for global governance are very different, normative terms. I mean, for example, everything that has to do with the role of the state vis-a-vis the role of the individual, in governance of disruptive technologies, for example, this is very related to. So, I mean, I cannot deny that we are systemic rivals in some areas. But there is another issue, which is, what are the implications of being systemic rivals? And this is the huge debate, I think, is there, because being a systemic rival, is that not necessarily imply that you might be, like a threat to each other, a systemic threat to each other? Not necessarily, So there is the discussion. I think it's more there, Yeah. So that's one question. And related with Global Gateway, for me, I don't want to get, because we don't have much time, I don't want really to get into the debate. But for me, Global Gateway and BRI are more narratives, than anything else. The things they're doing, they were there before, but now they brought the investment, they brought, the cooperation in a different kind of narrative, And it's very difficult. I think it's very difficult, for BRI and Global Gateway to cooperate, because they are confronting narratives in order to increase, the influence of those countries. Of course, these initiatives are not only about geopolitics, but geopolitics is there too. China, of course, doesn't like the geopolitical narrative linked with the inception of the Global Gateway as an alternative to BRI, because this was very explicitly made, by the European Commission, so quite obviously China does not like that way of presenting the BRI as the Global Gateway as an alternative, to the BRI.
I don't think that China is out there with a predetermined list of values, norms that it wants to push at the international system. It is pretty much of a negotiation and back and forth with different actors. So in this sense, I don't think that it is that black and white, like we have different values than China, so it's a rival. If we stay at the table with China, we might be able to negotiate these norms and values of the international system, I think. So I guess the short answer is no, and we should continue talking with China, is my point. For the Global Gateway, it has serious governance issues. Like this famous quote about the EU, we were just talking about, like, if we adapted to Global Gateway, if I want to talk with Global Gateway, or if the target countries, partner countries, want to talk with Global Gateway, who are they going to call? We don't know. Are they going to call like DG INTPA? Are they going to call AAS? Who are they going to call? We don't know. Nobody knows in Brussels. And San Bilal, from again the Brussels scene, from ICDM, said something very good. I totally agree. That the we talk with the partner countries within the framework of Global Gateway in the way that we talk among ourselves. There is no division between internal and external language. So every time we talk with African or Latin American countries, we go there with a different deals. Like we talk about Green Industrial Deal one day. We talk about what was the previous Green Deal? Was it just a Green Deal? But you know what I mean. Like we talk about like competitiveness compass, digital compass, this and that, and that confuses them, the partner countries. So about what Global Gateway is and what its promises. So what we need to do is to decide, to form a coordination mechanism and like a one institution in Brussels to actually coordinate among all these different partners, so that we can have a unified voice to the partner countries about what Global Gateway's promises are. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much again to all the speakers, to the team of CIDO for organizing this event, and they deserve a big round of applause.